You're a picture of Christ suffering. What? Well, thanks. I thought I was a hot piece of Nicolicious, but I guess I'm a picture of Christ suffering. That's real encouraging. Hey, everybody, welcome to this episode of Nick Speaks, the podcast devoted to giving the disabled community a voice where we speak up, speak out, and speak loud. I am your host, Nicholas Comstock. You guys, today I want to talk about something that I know a lot of disabled people like myself have struggled with throughout the years, especially if you're in a wheelchair, if you have Down syndrome, if you have autism, any physical disability that is noticeable. And I'm sure it has happened to those who have mental challenges too, mental challenges as well. But I'm mostly coming from the standpoint of those who have physical disabilities and it's noticeable. Um, I am a born again Christian. I grew up in a Christian home. I've been a Christian since um 2014. That's when I decided to really become a Christian. I grew up in a Christian home all my life and went to church. And today, I'm just going to talk about the complex that the church world and the disabled world have. You know, church is supposed to be a place of where you're loved, where you're accepted no matter what your ailment. And I have found that in a lot of cases through my church experience to be not true. Um, and I'm going to talk about that today. Like I said, I grew up in church all my life, and I grew up in a very big church, what people would call a mega church. I grew up 20 minutes outside of Chicago in Northwest Indiana, and one of the largest churches of its kind in Northwest Indiana, and a fundamental, independent, King James only Baptist church. You'll hear me say that a lot on this podcast. Uh, I grew up in a fundamental Baptist church, and our pastor at the time was very well known, was a very charismatic, poised speaker, and for whatever reason, I was the target and so many other people were that had disabilities, especially those of us in wheelchairs. We were the target of a lot of his sermon illustrations, and this has happened primarily in the church that I grew up in, but I've noticed as I go to different churches as I get older that pastors and church leaders tend to pick out those of us with physical disabilities and use us as examples for their congregation and for their sermons. And that really bothers me. It's like, can't I just go to church and be ministered to like a normal adult without a disability? I mean, I don't want to be put on a pedestal, and I hated it every time. I shouldn't say every time. Maybe when I was a little kid, it was cool. You know, pastor mentioned me from the pulpit. He mentioned my name. He knows who I am. But as I got older, like in my teenage years, early 20s, late 20s, 30s, and so on, it really got annoying. And one particular Sunday, it really hurt me. The pastor that I was telling you about, that I grew up under, he liked to preach messages on trials. So a lot of times he would preach messages on the trial of Job or the trial of Achan or what David went through when he committed adultery and or how he lost his son or how King David murdered Bathsheba's husband and the trial he went through there, or the trial of Joseph. So he would try to always uh, preach a message on on trials that people went through in the Bible and make those applicable to us today. And we had a section in my church where I grew up where I don't know who came up with the name of it, but it was called Wheelchair Alley. I hated that name. All the people in the wheelchairs sat there. It was actually a really nice big church, so we weren't like segregated to the back or to the middle sections when all the people stand up and you got the big watermelon heads and you can't see. I was actually able to sit next to my parents. And for whatever reason, we sat 7 rows from the front. That's what my dad wanted. He liked to be up close to the service, which was fine. And whenever my pastor would start preaching on these trials, he would mention a whole list of people in wheelchairs in the church. And sometimes my name was first, sometimes my name was the only name he mentioned. And this particular Sunday, he was talking about, I believe, the trial of Job and how Job at one point felt like he was in a prison. And he was talking about sometimes we go through trials and it becomes our prison. And he started to mention every person in a wheelchair that was in our church, my name. He went down their name and he was like, Joe. And then he would say something nice about Joe. And then he would go to John and he would say something nice about John. Or he would go to Peter and he would say something nice about Peter. And I'm just making up names. But then he came to me and he said, Nick, your wheelchair's a prison. And God says, deal with it. And not only did he just say that to me, but this preacher was a fire and brimstone preacher, so he was actually yelling because that's what fire and brimstone preachers do. They get you in a room and they yell at you for 2 hours on a Sunday morning or a Sunday night or a Wednesday night, especially if you were in a fundamental Baptist church because you're supposed to go Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night. And when my pastor looked at me and said, Nick, your wheelchair's a prison and God says deal with it. That hit me like a ton of bricks because I already felt like I was in prison. I didn't get out of my house other than to go to medical appointments in church and if we had any other family events. Otherwise, I would be in my house all the time because this was after, I left school. This was in my mid 20s at the time. And, and he literally said to me, Nick, your wheelchair is a prison, and God says, deal with it. And from that Sunday morning on, I remember begging my parents to let me sit in the back with some friends. And eventually they gave in. Sometimes I would go just do it, not tell them where I was. But then I got in trouble. Um, but I went and I sat in the back for every service after that, for several years because I was just like, you're telling me something I already feel. My wheelchair is a prison. But then on top of that, you are telling me that this God, who is supposed to be all loving, compassionate, long suffering, said to you to tell me, Pastor, to deal with my prison. which is my wheelchair. So that really smoked me really bad. And I really struggled with that for a long time, because there are still days where I feel like my wheelchair's a prison. And pastors, what I want to say to you is, first of all, always ask if you can use someone that has a disability in your church as a sermon illustration. And by God, don't use them every week. It's annoying when we're pointed out every week. Oh, I remember getting pointed out in high school Christian chapel. Nicholas is going to get more rewards than all of you when you get to heaven. Well, wait a minute, sir. Why am I going to get more rewards than everyone sitting here? Just because I have a smile on my face and I'm happy most of the time, which at that time, my happiness, I mean, I've always tried to have a positive outlook on life, but at that time, my happiness was for the people that I had to go be in front of, my teachers, my church leaders. A lot of times I would go in my room and sit by myself and just cry with depression. And I was not happy. I was very angry with God. And then you have these well-meaning ministers and not really educated ministers, but well-meaning ministers say to a crowd of 300 people, Nicholas is going to get more rewards than all of you when he gets to heaven. Well, first of all, sir, how do you even know that? And that's embarrassing because that makes people look at me and say, well, how is he better than me? What is he doing for God that I'm not doing? So that puts me in an awkward spot. Another thing that I've always struggled with in church when it comes to church is I've always struggled with getting involved, and I'm still struggling with this now. Um, you know, when I was growing up, I didn't have much interaction with my youth group because the youth pastor, first of all, he played favorites, but everybody knew that. So if you weren't his favorite, disability or not, you were kind of out of the in crowd. You were kind of an outcast. But I didn't really get to go on youth activities or youth outings because the youth pastor and the senior pastor didn't make sure that I had a way to get there and didn't make sure that I had a way to get included. So many times I felt lonely in the youth group, and I felt like I didn't fit in. And I felt like the only thing that I was good for was a sermon illustration, which was really annoying. Um, so, youth pastors and pastors, if you have disabled folks in your church, which I know most churches do, some only have one disabled person, some have multiple disabled people. Make sure that they know that they have a place in your church. And dear God, make sure that if they want to be in front at their church, they don't have to go to decide this is where I'm going to sit. Make sure they have a place where they can park their chair or they can sit where they can see whether or not the big watermelon heads are standing up. And make sure that they're included in the congregation and they're included in the worship, not put off in the back somewhere or the middle section. Every year for several years, my church had a major pastors' conference, and so we took a week off of school. My church also ran a private school, and we took a week off of school to go up to that pastors' conference. And I remember always trying to get involved. And finally, the pastor and the youth pastor got together and said, let's do this for Nick. But do you know what the job was? The job was sitting somewhere up on the third floor of the church building by a locked door at the church auditorium, telling people they could not bring food or drink into the church auditorium. Well, they weren't going to bring food or drink into that door anyway because it was locked. So, you know what I did? I went down and I got on our church elevator, and for the entire week, I was known as the elevator operator. And I had such a great time. But you know what? I shouldn't have had to come up with that job. And the leadership should have done something more than just giving themselves a pat on the back and said, "Oh, yay, we got Nick a little job. He should feel included." No, what you did was you found something that would get me out of your way, and you thought that would make me feel included, but instead it made me feel more lonely and more isolated. That's what you did. And but you knew it was going to make you look good, which I just made myself look good when I went and I made myself the elevator operator. Also, what I want to say to any church leaders who may be listening to this, I have always been taught to get around my church leaders, be around them, get close with them, have good relationships with them. And this is something that I've really struggled with as well, because, like I said, I went to a mega church, and it just all the leaders were always so busy that they couldn't make time for me. What I ended up finding out, sorry, I'm having trouble finding my words today. What I also ended up finding out is that when you go to a smaller church, it doesn't get any better. Because my mom used to tell me all the time, "Oh, Nick, when you get to a smaller church, not like the one we grew up in, when you get to a smaller church, a pastor will have time for you. A pastor will love you." And to be honest with you, I can think of two pastors that I've had out of the whole entire time of my life that have really taken time to pour into me. And that's really sad. And when I would make requests to meet with these leaders, I'm going to be honest and say I was looking for a friend because I was very lonely. And I was needing time outside of my house, so I was trying to get them to, get me to go out to eat with them, or maybe they could just come over to my house. And a lot of them, they would look at me and say, "Nick, why don't you spend time with God? You have all this time on your hands. Why don't you spend time with God?" And I really felt them saying spend time with God was code word for I'm too busy doing ministry. I'm too busy working for God to spend time with you. So why don't you go spend time with God and let me continue working with God and just leave me alone? When really it wasn't that they were busy with ministry, I don't think. They just didn't know how to handle me like so many other people don't. So, church leaders, I just want to reiterate, make time for those in your congregation who are disabled. And don't make assumptions about their disability. And don't say things like, "Your disability is a prison. Deal with it." Well, having that face is a prison. I'm sorry, you have to deal with that, you know? Um, because you don't know what that person is going through that has a disability. They could be getting abused by their family or their caregiver, and then they go to your church and they're looking for love, acceptance, and God's peace. And you point them out directly and you say, your wheelchair's a prison or your Down syndrome's a prison. And God says, deal with it. You know how damaging that is, pastors? Do you know that that is not the love of God? That is just harsh. That is mean. And if you're someone out there with a physical disability who has had a church leader tell you that your disability is a prison and God has told him to tell you to deal with it, please know that that's not God. That's your pastor drinking the Kool-Aid, and it's not God's Kool-Aid. I can tell you that right now. I also want to say I grew up being told that my disability is my cross. And I've said this many times before on my TikTok channel, which is at Nicholas Comstock, by the way. Follow me. I've said this many times before on my TikTok channel. I don't like being told my wheelchair is a cross because to me, I think that's blasphemous. I think because Jesus went through so much on the cross. I haven't been through 1/10 of what Jesus has been through. And you're going to tell me that my wheelchair is my cross? And another statement that I hate from church leaders. You're a picture of Christ suffering. What? Well, thanks. I thought I was a hot piece of Nicolicious, but I guess I'm a picture of Christ suffering. That's real encouraging. So yeah, just pastors, things not to say, things not to do, things to do, making your disabled community feel included in your church. And by the way, just don't include somebody who is disabled because they are disabled. Include a disabled man or woman in your church because you know what their strengths are and you know what they would be good at. And please, for the love of God, don't say for the first thing, oh, would you like to be a greeter? Why is that everybody's response to a disabled person who wants to work? Oh, you could be a Walmart greeter. Oh, you want to work in our church? Oh, you could greet people as they come in. No, I mean, that's fine. And if they say they want to do that, but literally sit down with your disabled congregants one on one and say, okay, what is your strengths? What are you good at? What do you feel like God's leading you to do in our church? What do you think your contribution could be? Don't just give them a job in your church, whether it's volunteer or paid, to pat yourself on the back, pastor or um, leader of your volunteer ministry. Don't just give someone with a disability a job in your church just to pat yourself on the back. That's good. People with disabilities in our church are working, and the best part of it is they don't bother me because they're busy. No. The disabled congregation in your church probably needs you more than your non-disabled. So you need to be checking on them a lot more. So I hope me sharing my church experience today has helped. And I'm not sharing this from a place of bitterness. I'm sharing my stories from my church experience to help other pastors and other church leaders. And like I said at the beginning of this podcast, to give the disabled a voice because some people that are disabled may have went through the same thing and they just don't have the strength to speak up. But I want to encourage you, other disabled folks out there. This is another episode of my podcast. Start a podcast. Start speaking out. Start speaking up. Start telling your story because only you can tell your story. Thanks for listening to Nick Speaks, guys, where we speak up, speak out, and speak loud and give those in the disabled community a voice who feel they don't have one. Please follow me on all my social media platforms, my Instagram at Nick Speaks Official, my TikTok at Nicholas Comstock, and you can always email me at nickspeaksofficial.com. And for those of you who are watching on YouTube, thank you for subscribing. And if you're not watching on YouTube, you can go to my YouTube channel and watch the video version of this at Nicholas Comstock on YouTube. I will see you next time on Nick Speaks. Thanks for listening. Bye bye.